Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Commonwealth Cyber Initiative's Clearance Preparedness Program. We're very excited to have some special guests here with us today. We've got Matthew, is it Posid? Am I saying that correctly?
Yep.
Posid from KPMG. And as always, Dr. Eric Berger as our host. I'm Sarah Hayes. I'm just going to go over a couple of housekeeping items, and then I'm going to turn it over to Eric. Please, everyone, make sure that your first and last name are reflected in your Zoom name for credit. As I look through the participant list, it looks like that's the case, so thank you very much. If you've called in, please send an email to ashock@vt.edu to verify your phone number. I don't see that anyone has called in, but just in case. Just as a reminder, our next clearance preparedness module will be hosted on October 25th at noon. You do not need to register if you have already registered, but please join us. We'd also invite you to join us to our virtual internship and job fair tomorrow, starting at 10 a.m. You can register for the event on our website. I will put that into the chat box so that everyone can see the link to register if you've not already registered. It is 100% virtual, so you can pop in and out anytime in between your classes. And then last but not least, if you're a student that is close to or at one of the campuses at JMU, UVA, William & Mary, or George Mason, and have research you're interested in commercializing or are curious about STEM entrepreneurship, we are hosting our meetup to startups over the next couple of weeks, and you can also register for those on our website. The one at JMU is this evening, so if you want to check that out, I'll also put the registration information in the chat for that as well. And I think that's it. Without further ado, Eric, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And yes, it's my pleasure to introduce Matthew Posid here today. He's the Chief Security Officer at KPMG. And that could be an aspiration for many of you after a government cyber career. I am sure that given that, though, too, you might be interested in his role as the Chief Information Security Officer at the CIA. He is a graduate of 2 CCI schools, Virginia Tech with a bachelor's in computer science and George Mason with a master's in electrical engineering. I heartily endorse that selection of majors. As well as certificates from the MIT Sloan School, another place I would heartily endorse looking at things to do after you graduate. So rather than going on forever, Matt, I'd like to just hand it over to you and go right ahead. And again, before though, some students have already asked, is my name showing up? So you know how to use the text box. If you have any questions, feel free to pop them in and we'll try to get to them. Thanks a lot. Go ahead, Matt.
All right, Eric, thank you for that introduction. Sarah, thank you for kicking us off today. And to all of you, looks like we have about 35 people on the call. Thank you for taking an hour to join us today as we talk about cybersecurity careers and specifically careers supporting classified U.S. government missions. Preparing for today, I had the opportunity to go back through some of the prior conversations you've had via this forum. Even having spent 20 plus years supporting the U.S. government, I found some of them informative. It gave me some good context, some good understanding for discussions you've already had. And I've tried to the degree possible to make this a bit of newer, fresher content so that it wasn't kind of the same thing over again. So hopefully I've achieved that. My real goal for today, though, is to make this next hour as meaningful for you all as possible. And I think the best metric we can have for that is making sure we're talking about what you want to talk about, not what I want to talk about. So while I have about 6 or 7 slides, I've designed them to fill about half of our time. I've designed them in a way that hopefully gives you all latch points or areas you want to ask questions about. And frankly, if I don't ever get to any of my slides and we spend 60 minutes having dynamic Q&A about cyber careers in the federal government, I will consider today a success unless I get a note from Sarah saying it was not. But I think that's really the goal here today, is to provide a venue for you to learn about not just the career field, but specifically how that career field supports the federal government. Really looking forward to today's conversations. And with that, let's jump into it. Full disclosure in advance, I am a normal Teams user and a Zoom newbie. And so I am probably going to bungle some things, but we're going to try to get through this together. I am fairly certain I am sharing my screen. If for some reason I'm not, Eric, Sarah, just jump in and let me know, but I think I'm good here. So as Eric mentioned, my name is Matt Posid. I currently serve as the Chief Security Officer at KPMG. And throughout the course of today, we're going to go through a couple of different things. At the core of our conversation, I want to talk about how we can perform cyber careers for the U.S. government that require clearance. But I think to properly put some context around that, we need to talk about cyber careers in general. And to do that a little bit, I want to start by talking about my lineage and pedigree. What did my background look like? How did I get into this field, and what have I been doing in it? I'm going to go through this for a couple of reasons. One, to sort of establish I have been there. I'm not just a talking head. You can rely a little bit, at least, on what I have to say. Two, I'm going to try to give you some very intentional anchor points or lash points from which you might want to ask questions. I've supported classified programs in a variety of different ways over more than 2 decades. And I think as I unpack and explore a couple of those different ways, it might set off some alarm bells, cause some questions to come up. So I want to focus on that. And then I'll briefly touch a little bit on my professional education background as well. Again, mainly to give you latch points to say, why'd you do that? Why'd you pursue those certifications? Was that valuable or not, as the case may be, if you don't want to ask those questions. But again, all these slides were really geared towards creating discussion points that might be interesting to you. We're then going to get into sort of a brief overview of the cyber career field, spend kind of the core of the meeting on cyber careers in classified space, and then I'll close out with some general cyber career management advice. I know throughout there's Q&A opportunities. Eric, I think if I recall correctly, you're going to toss out questions if or as they come in so that I don't have to triple task. My wife has told me many times I can't actually multitask. I do 2 things poorly. And so I'm not even going to try to read the Q&A on my own. I will just rely on Eric for that. So with that, let's jump into it. Or any questions before I start, actually? Let's start with that. Any questions live, Eric, or are we good?
Yeah, right now we're good.
All right, so let us jump into a little bit about my background. I began supporting classified programs in the U.S. government back in 1999. And I know this is a group of college students. So 1999 was before you, right? A long time ago, I've been supporting federal programs. And I began after my freshman year in college. I began as an intern with the U.S. Naval Research Lab, doing research and development into satellite and wireless communication technologies that were going to be used predominantly by the Navy, but other parts of the military and government to support their global mission around the world. At this point in time, I had a secret level clearance, and that was pretty unique amongst my peer group of college students to have a security clearance, but I had a secret level clearance. One of the things that was really interesting about this period of time is the substantial majority of the work I did was completely unclassified. The work was really about designing, developing, and advancing the state of wireless and satellite communications. And in fact, many of the things that are ubiquitous today and that we take for granted, I had a role in helping design and invent a solution 2 decades ago. But the work itself mostly was unclassified. It was the applications of that work that were fairly classified. Why the military was asking for it, how they plan to deploy it, the design constraints and considerations we needed to understand about their operating environment. Those were the things that were really classified. And this remains true today about a lot of government research and development programs. A lot of the research is stuff that can be shared and worked in partnership with academia and other areas, despite the fact that its ultimate destination is classified locations for the US government. So I did this for 3 years. I spent every summer with the Naval Research Lab. I also spent my winter breaks. I also took a full semester off and worked with them. And then following graduation, I joined the Central Intelligence Agency. And over the course of about 19 years, I had about 10 different roles. And while there's an exception or 2 thrown in, they can basically be bucketed into 3 categories. The first was hands-on IT engineering, technical roles that largely built upon the work I was doing at the Naval Research Lab, doing satellite and wireless communications, supporting CIA's global mission in austere environments that didn't have access to traditional communication technologies. We'll just phrase it that way. I then shifted into a series of IT management roles. And Each of these by design was in an area that was not my technical background. I worked in desktop and server engineering. I worked in infrastructure and platform as a service before those were terms, but I was running all of our on-premise hosting environment. I led some of our cloud computing activities, and then I moved into sensitive data management. And in each of those 4 roles, I had the opportunity to see a really interesting intersection of innovative technology and yesterday's mentality about cybersecurity. So, for example, in the desktop engineering role, I was in a position where we had individuals and professionals with 3, 4, 5 different desktops on their desk. That's kind of cumbersome. That's hard to operate, but we were worried about data going from network to network to network. And I was charged with how do we design one computer system that can talk to all of those networks, but in a manner that doesn't allow for data to transit between them. An IT project, sure, but absolutely a security conversation too. When I was in data center management, I was running all of our on-premise hosting when VMware and virtualization became all the rage, right? What does isolation mean now when you can do it virtually instead of physically? And is that sufficient? Is that enough? Or do we still need physical isolation? When I was working on cloud computing, we were charged with how do we bring in a hyperscale cloud provider, an Amazon, an IBM, a Google, a Microsoft, and outsource the majority of the IT across the intelligence community to a world-class hyperscale cloud provider. And this was security in every way, shape, and form, from data center engineering to completely different business models to how much access do we allow these cloud providers to have. And I moved into sensitive data management and think kind of Tom Cruise Mission Impossible sort of stuff, things that aren't even on enterprise IT. And the real challenge we had was how do we leverage this new cloud environment to process our most sensitive intelligence payloads so we can actually get meaningful value out of this to help the CIA achieve its mission objectives and to help the country. So at each of those, while they were IT roles, they absolutely touched on pioneering aspects of cybersecurity that the CIA, the US government, the industry at large was wrestling with at the time. And so after a series of those, I found myself actually moving directly into a cybersecurity role, and I became CIA's Deputy Chief Information Security Officer and ultimately the Chief Information Security Officer. And in these roles, not only was I impacting the cyber program at the CIA, but I was working with colleagues across the intelligence community, the Department of Defense, and the broader federal civilian agencies. And so these roles gave me broad exposure to cyber programs across the entirety of the US government and offer me opportunities to shape federal cyber policy and shape the future that is still playing out in how the government led and designed cybersecurity programs. 3 years ago, I decided to move to the private sector, and I came to KPMG, where I still maintain a security clearance, where I still support classified programs in the US government. I just do it from another perspective now. I do it as a member of the Defense Industrial Base, a cleared contractor that is supporting the US government by bringing niche expertise and key personnel and services that the government might not have internally, and providing that as now a contractor into the government. I came here as KPMG's Chief Information Security Officer, and about 3 months ago moved to become our Chief Security Officer, where we have now brought together our cyber, physical, insider risk, enterprise resilience, crisis management. If it looks, feels, smells like protecting the organization, it now falls under our enterprise security program, and I'm leading all aspects of that. So a variety of different roles supporting the classified business, from secret level work that was research and development to true design and delivery and cyber executive work, to now supporting as a member of the Defense Industrial Base. And in each of these, I had various opportunities to see aspects of the government mission that we can certainly talk about depending on what questions you may have. I also want to touch briefly on the right-hand side of this. Eric already mentioned that I'm a proud alumni of 2 CCI universities, Virginia Tech and George Mason. I very, very intentionally got these 2 degrees in 2 different programs. In fact, one of the things you never heard on the left was I wrote code at any point in time, and yet my undergrad is in computer science. One of the things I'll talk about later is finding your own path and your own career journey that maximizes your skills And for me, one of the things I wanted to do was have a very broad set of skills across technical disciplines. So I very strategically sought out 2 different academic credentials that would allow me to kind of have a broader foundation. I then certainly went on to pick up a couple of executive things as I continue to mature in my professional journey. And then more recently, I picked up several different industry cybersecurity certifications. Again, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, happy to discuss why those, why not others, are they valuable, are they not, what is the industry perspective on those? One of the things I'll say is in a lot of government programs, they are compulsory because the government is looking for people to show they have a certain pedigree of cybersecurity knowledge. And many government organizations have a list of certifications their professionals need to maintain for the government to have confidence that they have the right caliber of professionals. So with that, let me do a click down and get into a bit more about the cybersecurity career. Now, you all are college students, and so I hope some of what I'm going to say here is stuff you already know, but I want to tell a real life story. My nephew's getting ready to go to college to study cybersecurity. He's going to go to Maryland. We won't hold that against him. They got a good program there too, right? And he came up to me recently and goes, Uncle Matt, you do that cyber stuff, right? I don't think he really knows what I do, but that's another issue, right? You do that cyber stuff. He goes, I really like scripting in this particular language, but I'm wondering what else I should learn. What languages do your people script in? I said, well, that's a really interesting question. Most of them don't write code in any way, shape, or form at all. And he said, then what do they do all day? And it was completely lost on him, the richness, the diversity of different careers you can have in cyber. And so this slide kind of helps, frame out a story I was talking with him about that. I said, cyber starts early with architecture and engineering. And if we rewind the clock 5-10 years ago, many companies didn't have architecture and engineering support in cyber programs. That was IT's job. IT would go build systems. They'd bring it to security and say, am I good enough in security? Would always say no, right? Because they missed something, they failed to meet certain design requirements. Security was always a bolt-on. It was never an intentional design consideration. Mature programs today invest heavily in cyber architecture, cyber engineering, and infusing security principles at the core of system design so they are built right. It makes them more secure, it gets them to market quicker, and it makes them cheaper throughout the entire life cycle to do that. So there's an entire architecture and engineering skill set that can touch almost any technical domain, from software engineering to infrastructure. There's a lot of focus here in how do we have experts that have the exact same skill sets as IT professionals, but a different accountability and responsibility to make sure their primary goal is security. All right, so now we've built a system, we want to make sure it's ready to go online. We have a whole other set of skill sets. We have assessors who come in and look at, have we met all of our controls right? Are we doing the things we need to do to meet our organizational risk tolerances? Great, controls look great on paper. Now let's try to break it, right? We've got pen testers who go in there and try to say, even though the control was built, is there a way to circumvent it? Is there a way around it? And we also have compliance professionals, and you might be asking, compliance, assessment, those words seem pretty synonymous. And there is a lot of overlap here. The way I'm using these terms, assessment is really about, does a system meet our internal rules, requirements, and risk tolerances? Compliance is really about, does it meet somebody else's? And this is an area that's particularly relevant if you are building technologies in regulated sectors, like the financial services sector, the healthcare sector, or if you're building systems that are going to support the federal government and have to meet certain NIST guidelines, like a NIST 800-171 or a NIST 853, and have to meet a certain rigorous control framework, because that's what's required by the entity that is endorsing this. And these compliance professionals really are all about, how do I obtain that clean bill of health from a third party who can actually certify that we're good enough. So we built it, we've assessed it, it's online, bad things happen, right? It just does, right? So we have an entire set of professionals who do threat analysis, threat hunting, incident response, advanced forensics. And lastly, we have a group of people whose job is to educate other people. And my nephew said, Uncle Matt, you teach people how to do cyber stuff? I go, no. I teach the other 50,000 people what to do. Because if only our security professionals are worried about cyber, we'll never be as secure as we need to be. Every single professional in our organization has a role in keeping our systems safe and our data safe. And mature cyber programs have an education component to them that is teaching everyone else what their responsibility is. And so after I laid this out for my nephew, I said, if you want to write code, if you really love that part of it, look at the pen testing work, maybe some engineering work, look at the incident response, look at the threat analysis. But keep in mind, that's about 1/3 of a rich cyber career. And I encourage him to explore all the other aspects that might be relevant as he has a rich career. So that's cyber, but then there's cyber adjacent. As I talked about on the last slide, I spent most of my career in IT engineering and operations roles. And arguably, you could say I was doing IT work, though as I described the history of those jobs, I think each of you would probably say it was a lot of cyber work too. There's also risk management work, audit work, and law enforcement work. And we're going to touch on that fourth one a little bit later in the deck. But a cyber career can touch any or every one of these boxes and have a different percentage of its time and its skill set spent across them. So as you're thinking about going out in the world, supporting classified programs, supporting the federal government, don't have it in your head that I can only do that a certain way. In fact, the people who are most successful in their career, the ones who reach those executive ranks over time, aren't going to be experts in all these by any means, but are certainly going to have an understanding of many of them so that they can serve at an executive level where they might have to make decisions that touch all of these business areas. So let me go one click further. And I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about government cybersecurity jobs compared to private sector cybersecurity jobs. What's the same? What's different? And frankly, a lot of things are the same. In fact, everything I put in that light blue box in the middle is pretty much the same. Right? It's not like private sector is only attacked by mom and pop hackers and the government is the only one who has to be worried about nation states. Right? Nation states are going after public and private. Speed and response and criticality, they're the same, public and private. But I do want to highlight a couple of key differences. First, on the private side, there's a significantly higher degree of focus on compliance and external regulations in the private sector because so much of the private industry is regulated, whether it's financial services or healthcare or defense industrial base, or pick your regulated sector. There is a need to prove to a regulator, to an external entity, to a government client, that you're meeting all of the necessary obligations. And this is a fascinating line of work that is sort of the intersection of cybersecurity, but also policy and regulation and even some legal activities. And team professionals who do this might have cybersecurity certifications, might also be attorneys, right? You have a vast array of skill sets to do this kind of work. The private sector also has one huge advantage the government does not, which is the ability to recruit and retain from a much broader applicant pool. I'm sure we've all heard studies that in the United States, we're about 700,000 headcount short of what we would like, and across the globe, about 3 million headcount short for cyber talent. Private sector can generally tap into all of the available resources across the globe. You know, as I was going back and listening to some of your prior clearance preparedness conversations, I heard conversations about citizenship, about recreational drug use, about things you can do in your personal time, about relationships and foreign reporting and financial disclosures. And there are things people simply don't want to do. And so the government has a limited population it can draw from, and it has to draw people within that population who are willing to live by all of these other rules. And it artificially constrains their talent pool, which is good and bad. The good is, if you're in that talent pool, you will never want for opportunity. There are far more federal cyber opportunities than there are cleared federal people. And if you want the two best pieces of job security in the world, no cyber, have a clearance. If you have either of those, you're almost guaranteed employment. If you have both, you will never want for opportunity. And that's a good thing. Eric, I see we have a question that came in.
Yeah, Matt, and it's a great one since you've done both. So this is like from the perspective of the private sector and the government. What about from your perspective? You've worked in government, worked in the private sector. So for you, what were some of the pros and cons of both, and which do you prefer?
Prefer is a hard question. So let me talk about pros and cons a little bit. Even in the private sector, I continue to support the federal business, certainly not entirely the federal business. but I can happily say I have spent 20 plus years supporting classified programs, and I believe my professional journey is richer for having done and continuing to do that. I think certainly the value, the intrinsic value of doing that kind of work is important to me as a professional. But some of the opportunities that I've had in the government, we're going to get a little more into those in the next slide. Some of the opportunities I've had in the government are opportunities you cannot replicate anywhere else. So that was certainly fascinating to me. One of the things I have really enjoyed about the private sector is getting to work with a vast array of different people, different backgrounds, different professionals. In the government, even if you switch agencies, even if you go from a government agency to a defense industrial based contractor, it's a relatively small community of people who are cleared at the upper echelons of the government clearance process. You work with the same people time and time and time again, and there are some amazing professionals, but it's a limited pool. And I have learned a ton by being exposed to people in the private sector who would not have ever been able to work in the government. And so there's pros absolutely on both sides. There isn't a better, there isn't a worse, there's just a different. And I know one of the things the government is actually trying to do is look at ways to make the going back and forth between these two sides a little bit easier. How can we create programs or incentives for government people to go out into the private sector for a few years and still easily return? And it's that easily return that can be problematic historically, because if you don't maintain your clearance, you have to start all over again. It's an onerous process. And so the government is also seeing that there are values to both sides of this, and they are encouraging government people to step out and yet to come back. In fact, I have a person on my staff currently who's on a government employee still on a 12-month leave of absence to go learn some acumen in the private sector before returning to the government. The government's going to benefit from that, as am I, during this 12-month period of time. So I don't think there's a better or worse. I think there's just two different opportunities. But there are some things that are unique to the government, and let me touch on those. The first is, what I'll say, is the availability of sensitive threat intelligence information. And I'll phrase it somewhat ambiguously and vaguely like that, but especially if you are a penetration tester or a cyber response professional, you know, the more you can understand about your adversary, the more you can understand about how they operate, how they think, how they might attack you, how they might operate if they are able to break into you, the better you can do your job. And while there are certainly incredibly vast sources of commercial grade cyber threat intelligence that private sector companies can, should, and do consume, there are unique data sets only available within the government, within the classified world. And as a cyber defender, if you want opportunities to understand how some of those threat actors are truly operating, it's the only place you can do it. You can gain access to information that can enrich your career because it's information that can't be available anywhere else and is really unique to that discipline. The other thing, I'm going to talk about this on the next slide in a little bit more detail, is you have significantly more opportunities to leverage cyber skills in somewhat of a non-traditional way. Still cyber, but not cybersecurity. So let's jump into that. So the first thing I want to comment on, I know this is going to go on YouTube, this is going to be out there for forever. These are snippets of job descriptions that were taken verbatim from CIA, NSA's, and FBI's website. The reason I did that is so I didn't inadvertently write down something I couldn't write down. Because as somebody who holds a clearance, who has had one and maintains one, we have an obligation to protect classified information for forever. And there's certainly a risk I could have described this work in a manner other than what we see on this screen if I had written my own words. And so I was very deliberate about taking words straight off of these websites while emphasizing certain parts that I want to touch on today. This is certainly not an exhaustive list of government unique opportunities, but it is a fairly complete list of sort of the niche kinds of things you can do in the government that you can't do anywhere else. And I believe one of your prior speakers was somebody who's currently at MITRE, who earlier in his career worked in an NSA role similar to what I'm going to describe. But we'll start with CIA and what they call cyber operations, right? Well, Matt, you already described incident response. That's cyber operations, right? It is, right? But not this, right? This is cyber operations on the other side of the coin. And this is about using the exact same knowledge and skills you have, but a radically different set of techniques in tradecraft, where you are leveraging cyber acumen to literally gather intelligence from adversary systems. You're going out to their system and figuring out how to obtain this so that you can drive the intelligence mission of the CIA, which ultimately informs policymakers and decision makers across the US government. NSA has a very similar role, even more ambiguously named, called a capabilities specialist, right? But they too are leveraging their cyber acumen to develop offensive capabilities, tools, techniques to target adversary networks. And they're creating new ways to get critical information, right? So I'm being very deliberate about reading words here, but let me come up a level and kind of translate, right? You're leveraging cyber acumen to essentially figure out how to obtain information that somebody on the other side is doing cyber defense against, right? Then a very different sort of nuance on classified careers is federal cybercrime, FBI cybercrime. This is something that is unique to law enforcement agencies, but these individuals take their cyber acumen and they learn a whole other set of acumen and tradecraft about how to be an investigator and law enforcement tradecraft, and they come with different authorities, and they are actually working to stop cyber threat actors from breaking into organizations, whether it is through tactical response and immediate response, advanced forensics, and ultimately holding them accountable through courts of law and law enforcement channels. Now, I'd offer, just to put this kind of simply, if you are trying to do something in the pink box or the orange box anywhere other than CIA, the people in the purple box are going to come looking for you, right? These truly are skill sets you cannot legitimately do anywhere else. Now, these certainly aren't the only cyber jobs in the US government. Every single government agency out there has cyber defense jobs. Every single government agency out there needs the things we talked about a couple of slides back: architecture, engineering, incident response, pen testing, education. But I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about things that can only be done in the government. And these are the kinds of jobs that Eric, when you asked the question earlier, private sector, public sector, and I said, I had some unique things I was able to do in the government that you literally couldn't have done anywhere else. It was being involved in work like this. It was knowing that my expertise and my acumen was contributing to national security in a way that could not be done anywhere else in the world. And from time to time throughout your career, you have some of those hoorah America moments that are never talked about. They're never in the newspaper, right? But they stick with you. And I've got 2 decades of experiences doing that as a very hands-on technologist, manager, and executive at the CIA. And I wouldn't trade those contributions to both my professional journey, but also my country, for any other opportunity. I am forever grateful that I spent time at the agency. And there's always the opportunity to return there, right? The government is trying to attract more and more boomerangs. People who worked there have left and have come back. And so I've certainly not closed the door on returning to this kind of world. But I'm certainly, in my current capacity, learning new things, new skills, having new opportunities right now. I wanted to touch on these 3 kinds of opportunities. There's a few other places you can do this, but by and large, these are the 3 biggest. So I want to jump into a couple of just closing points, and then that'll take us to hopefully about 12:40, leaving about 20 minutes for Q&A, which means I'm right on schedule. That's always good. You never know when you write content how it's going to play out. But the first thing I would encourage you to do is pursue continuous learning, no matter where your cyber career takes you. In 3 years, we will be defending against cyber threats that have not been invented yet, with technologies that have not been invented yet. And if you ever stagnate in your professional journey, you will find yourself becoming less and less relevant. And so one of the most important things you can do is pursue continuous learning. It doesn't mean you have to get degrees. It doesn't mean you have to get certifications, but it does mean you have to stay abreast of where the industry is going, where technology is going, where threats are going, and constantly learn what's coming down the pipe next. When I speak with my management committee, my board of directors, the first thing I always do is start with an education slide. How has the industry changed since the last time I've talked to you? It is an incredibly dynamic industry. And if we don't anchor on what's different first, I don't have context to tell the rest of my story. Pursue continuous learning. The second, get comfortable being uncomfortable. As a cyber professional, you are never going to deal in absolutes. You're going to deal with risks that may or may not materialize. You're going to be put in situations where you might need to say yes to something, or you might need to say no to something. Saying yes might incur business risk, and that's going to be on you. And saying no might shut down a system because of an incident that you're investigating, and that's going to also impact the business. And you're going to be put in positions where you have to be okay making that call. And I can tell you from experience, you're not going to always get it right. There's going to be times you're going to say, let's err on the side of caution, shut this down, and you're going to find out nothing wrong was there. And there's going to be times you say, yes, this is a reasonable risk to take, and something bad is going to happen. And that is the nature of this profession. And it's something you have to figure out how to get comfortable being in those positions time and time and time again. Reinvent yourself, right? I am a satellite and wireless engineer. I'm a general purpose IT manager. I'm a CA officer. I'm a CISO. I now run full spectrum security. Who I am has changed at 3, 4, 5 different points in my career. And that's not atypical. Most people have inflection points in their career where they change themselves in some way, shape, or form. A typical one is going from a technologist to a manager. Right? That's a journey many people do. But it's not uncommon to have completely tangential or unrelated career transitions also. For the first 15 years of my career, if you had told me I was going to end up in cybersecurity, I would have said, really, those are the guys who slow me down. Why would I ever do that? And I find myself actually having far more ability to contribute directly to organizational imperatives and deliver mission or business value by being in security than I ever did in an IT vertical. But I would have never seen that until I took a step out and reinvented myself. Next, become an expert at something. There's a lot of great talent out there, and there's a lot of smart people. Find a way to differentiate yourself. Find something you do better than most. Invest time, invest energy into maximizing your ability to do that, whatever it may be. And it may not even be a cyber skill set. It may be coaching or mentoring. It may be public speaking. It may be something else, but it's something that can set you apart a little bit from your peers. And it can help elevate you in your own professional journey. And lastly, there is no right path. Right, if we go 4 or 5 slides back, I laid out 9 different permutations of cyber skills, 4 adjacent types of roles. And that slide certainly wasn't complete, even though it was, pretty indicative of what options are out there. And there's 35, 38, 44 people on this call. Each of you is going to spend a different amount of time in each of those boxes. Each of you has different skills in each of those boxes. You need to take the path that maximizes your contributions. And if you try to follow somebody else in their path, unless you're the exact same person, you are going to sell yourself short. Figure out your path. And here's another secret, kind of like being uncomfortable. You're going to make missteps in those choices too. I have taken opportunities that I regretted later, but I learned a ton by doing it. And if it were not for those opportunities, I wouldn't be where I am today. So not only is there not a right path, there are very few things you can do, even if it's a misstep, that don't help you get where you want to go in the long run. So we're about 40 minutes into it. As I said at the beginning, I really want to focus on things you want to focus on. I see a couple of questions coming in. So my hope is to spend the rest of the time in dynamic Q&A. I'm going to take the slides down. We can talk about literally anything you all want to talk about the CIA specifically, defense industrial base, classified careers across the government, cyber in general. I really want to maximize your time and your value here. So Eric, if you can help be the MC.
Absolutely. Well, related to that last slide, the last things you were talking about, one of the questions we've got is with continuous learning, is that something that could contribute to career burnout. So there are kind of a few parts of the question. One is, is that a way of avoiding burnout? Can you get burned out by kind of overdoing it? And then, just general advice or insight on burnout and cybersecurity, because just as we hear there are so many jobs, we hear it can be a kind of stressful job. And then, of course, there's always that, and what about public versus private sector?
Yep. So let me start on kind of the first angle of that, which was just continuous learning contribute to burnout. I'll start out with kind of the lawyerly response of everyone's different, past performance does not guarantee future results. That's investment, not lawyer, but whatever. Same thing applies here, is there is no universal answer to that question. But what I'll say by and large is the professionals who work for me value that time as a time away from their day job. It's almost a reset for them, and a chance to, one, learn new things, two, to kind of reignite their love of cyber and what got them into this, and three, depending on how your organizations do it, certain training opportunities can almost be seen as rewards. Hey, everyone might need this basic course, but maybe you get to go to this special conference that's in a fun location, right? And so provided training is done instead of, not in addition to, your 40-hour work week, it can absolutely be seen as a way to decompress and help avoid the burnout syndrome. If you find yourself not being able to make time for training, and what that's normally indicative of is an organization that does not prioritize employee development. If you find yourself in that environment, oftentimes you could see a leader would say, yeah, go do all your entire job, go take training on your own time. That's an environment that, forget whether or not it's cyber or any other domain, that's an environment where your leader doesn't prioritize employee development, and that will actually be the driver of burnout, not necessarily the fact that you took training. So I think by and large, most people see training as a reset point. They see training as confidence their leadership has to invest in them. I certainly know when the CIA paid for me to go to MIT to take 6 different executive education classes, I viewed that as a reward. I viewed it as an investment. I viewed it as an endorsement that things were going really, really well. And it was a much more powerful piece of feedback than had they given me a good performance review. And so most organizations try to leverage training to really develop their people and show their people matter to them. So I think by and large, it helps avoid burnout. Now let's take part 2, burnout in general. Wow, that's a hard one, right? And I think it's a harder one in a world where many of us work from home. When COVID happened, I was still at the CIA. I was their CISO. This may shock you, but the CIA did not have a robust work from home program because their CISO was an asshole. And I can say that because it was me. But it's just not an area where we're going to work from home, right? We don't have the physical security. We don't have the technology security. We don't have the insider risk security of who else is in your house. Highly classified work has to be done in certain locations. Now, lots of other agencies were able to work remotely, but most of the intelligence community was not able to do so for lots of good reasons. And so I had to work in that environment, still going into the office every day. I came to KPMG in December of 2020, about 9 months into COVID. Everyone else knew how to work like this. I had no idea how to work like this. And I had to figure it out after they were already mature at it. So they had figured out their own personal tricks. And I got burnt out. I got burnt out because I couldn't figure out how to step away. I got burnt out because you don't have 10 minutes between meetings to walk down the hall. You're hanging up and redialing. And there was no forced separation from your work. I had to figure out how to create that. And I think 3 years in, there's a set of jobs that may never go back to the office. And that's okay. But what's not okay is letting that drive your burnout. You have to create separation. You have to create opportunities to step away. When you close out work for the night, pretend you were closing out an office building and you weren't back in. And you got to figure out ways to recharge yourself during the workday also. Personally, I try to take a walk at lunch, right? It gets me away from my desk. I leave my phone on my desk. I recognize I'm in a 24/7 response job. if they need me every minute of the day, though, if they can't get by 20 minutes without me, we've got a problem. So I step away, right? And I create that intentional separation. Burnout is a risk. There is always, in any job, there is more work than you can do. What really helps prevent burnout is self-discipline, self-awareness, knowing what tires you out and knowing what recharges you. I can tell you when I'm on PTO, when I'm not at work, sometimes what recharges me is going and reading 10 emails just because it turns my brain back on, a lot better than reruns of Suits does, right? And so sometimes I go gravitate towards work because it recharges me. And I love Suits, for the record, but it's what I was watching today. It's why it was fresh on my mind. So I hope that answers that question a little bit. And I hate to give you a pins kind of answer, but everyone recharges differently. Introverts different than ambiverts, different than extroverts. Everyone's got to find their own balance, whether they're in an office or remote.
Great. Actually, since you were just mentioning a boss who doesn't care about you, one of the questions is, as you know, the students are doing their job searches, are there like good signs or red flags when they're either researching an employer or speaking to an employer? And likewise, from your perspective on the hiring side, what are you looking for, kind of beyond certifications and work experience? Kind of what are the other things that are important?
Yeah. So when I am interviewing a boss, and that's the way I personally approach the interview process, right? Which one of you is going to get lucky enough to have, right? That's the mentality I have walking into any interview I've ever been in. I look for three things in a boss. The first is it someone I can learn from? That's kind of a low bar. We can learn from almost anyone who's different than us. They've got something we can learn from. So there's very few people you can't learn from. Number two, is it someone I can respect? Right? I can learn from an idiot. I can learn what not to do. I can learn the few things they do right. I may not respect that person, though. So the boss has to be somebody I'm also going to respect. And the third is somebody I can tolerate working for, right? I can learn from and respect the hell out of a Marine drill instructor, but I don't want to work for him day in and day out. And so those are kind of the three questions I ask myself when I'm talking to a prospective boss. Can I learn from them? Can I respect them? And is this someone I could see myself working for? Now, one of the things to keep in mind is bosses are also transitory, right? While I aim for 3 yeses there, if it is an organization I think is strong and a role that I think am a great fit for, I walk in also understanding that boss might leave too. And so I don't want to necessarily make a decision solely based on that. But research absolutely shows a bad manager is the number one driver of attrition. And so it is absolutely something you should keep in mind. So I look for a manager that I'm willing to work with who demonstrates those three things. Organizationally, I think that's a harder question. There's so many good companies out there. When I left CIA, I wrestled with that question myself. What industry? What else is? I don't know. I've literally been nothing but a government employee my entire life. And what I said to myself is, I believe the CIA is one of the best in the world at what they do. I said, I'm actually going to be industry agnostic. I will go work in any industry there is, as long as where I land is one of the best in the world at what they do. And so I talked to major banks, major telecoms, major construction companies, professional services firms, et cetera. And I could have learned a ton and had a very fulfilling job in any of them. KPMG certainly meets the definition of one of the best in the world at what they do, is one of the big four accounting firms. And that opportunity worked out for me. But I didn't look so much at the industry as much as I looked at, is this company an A player at what they do? And if so, they're probably an organization focused on people development, focused on hard work ethic, and the kind of organization I want to be part of. So that's kind of what I looked at when I was vetting organizations.
Oh, that's great. And then another kind of detail question. You've got a couple of certificates, and do you think that it's worthwhile to like pay to take a course from a third party to kind of like, is that more efficient to learn, or are there other things, what would you offer if someone did want to get these certificates? How, what have you seen as like a good way of doing it?
Yeah. So at the risk of you all administratively hanging me up if I get this question completely wrong here, I'm not a fan of certifications. And yet they are absolutely necessary. But I view it kind of like the SAT going into college. My wife got 400 points lower than me on the SAT. She did far better in college than I did, and far better in high school. But I'm a really good test taker. And the SAT did not show which one of us was the better student. And yet, it was compulsory, right? There are many, many, many jobs that are going to absolutely require you to have cybersecurity credentials because it is a way to sort of put everyone on an equal playing field. You must get some because they're necessary to do that. Now, if you're also in a professional services role where you were offering your resume as a service, right? You're basically selling your lineage and pedigree as a professional. They matter more and more and more because they establish unambiguous bona fides to somebody who's reading it. But by and large, I believe sort of the academic material presented in certifications programs is different than what you use in the real world. I'll give you two real examples. I got my CSSP cert shortly after I became CIA's deputy CISO. And what one of my senior advisors told me at the time was, go get your CISSP before you learn how it's actually done, because otherwise the real world will confuse you when you're answering the questions. Similarly, when I got my certified CISO, which I got when I came to KPMG, the instructor, there were two current CISOs in that class, and the rest of the class was aspiring CISOs. The instructor said, this is the answer to pass the test, and then went to me and the other and said, now what would you have actually done? And that's not just true of cyber certifications. I have some amazing program managers who work for me who have made similar observations about the PMP test. I've heard about others. It is the nature of the difference between academics and reality. It is why organizations like CCI that let you have hands-on internships are incredibly important to augment academic understanding. The real world is different than the textbook. And so certifications, I think, are absolutely compulsory. Everyone needs a couple, but I wouldn't go chasing 15 of them. I'd find a nice, stable foundation of certifications that allow you to meet that minimum bar, to tell your story, to get in a room to explain your actual work background and your competency. Your certifications are only kind of a minimum qualification to set that up. As for learning styles, I absolutely love the boot camps personally. I think I would have struggled greatly to get my certifications without a boot camp because they truly do teach to the test, right? They say these are the areas you want to better understand. These are the areas you might not. For example, if I picked up the CISSP manual, there was a really big meaty section in the middle about laws and regulations. And the boot camp instructor, while bound by certain ethical rules of can't disclose what's on the test, said, keep in mind, that's a US law and this is an international certification. All right, maybe I don't need to know much about the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, but GDPR that touches 25 countries may be much more relevant for me to understand. And so those kind of nuggets of wisdom from the instructor and even how they spend their time in the course helped me understand where to focus. And then personally, what I did is I took the boot camp and then the very next day took the test because I wanted it as fresh as possible for me. So my learning style is one where that environment helped. Other people learn better by reading books but what you can't do is rely on your practitioner expertise to go past the test because it is very definitional and very academic. So you could be the smartest cyber professional out there. You will probably need some kind of academic material to help you get the certification.
No, that's great. And actually, the same student has asked two questions. We only have time for one. They're both great, but I think one will be valuable for everyone, which is, did you have a mentor? And if you did, how do you identify great mentors and how did you leverage them? And, did you learn mistakes from working with them as well?
Yeah, have had multiple, currently have multiple, M1 to multiple. I would not be where I am without people to bounce ideas off of. And the reason I've had multiple is what you need as a professional and who you can learn that from changes as you go throughout your career. And so somebody who is absolutely instrumental early in their career may be the wrong skill set, even if they've grown linearly with you, maybe the wrong skill set for what you need in the middle of a career. When I've looked for mentors, personally, I always try to find a mentor who is not anywhere in my direct chain of command. While certainly I have been asked to mentor or meet with people in a mentoring relationship who are, I think it's sometimes hard for somebody to separate my management role from my mentoring role. And when I am a mentee, I want to be completely vulnerable. I don't want to walk into my boss and say, I have no idea what the hell I'm doing. But I do that with my mentor all the time. And if my boss is listening to this, I don't do that because I know what I'm doing, boss. But I do that with my mentor. And I look for people who think fundamentally different than me when I'm going to find a mentor. I think like an engineer, methodical, process-driven, objective. I look for people. I look for artistic creatives. I look for people who think fundamentally different than me. I already know how somebody who thinks like me would solve a problem. I don't know how somebody else would solve it. And I look for people who understand what a mentoring relationship is supposed to be, which is a guide who can offer perspective, but who will never pretend they have all the answers or even necessarily the right answer in your scenario, but somebody who can be a sounding board, a listening board to offer a different solution or perspective, and then ultimately help guide you to make your decision, because it's got to be your decision. And so and some mentors I've seen want it to be much more coaching like. This is what you need to do to fix it. This is what you need. Coaches are also valuable. I still use coaches from time to time. They can really help with niche areas you're trying to refine. Very different practice than mentorship. But I would absolutely encourage you to find many, each of which might help you in a different way.
That's great. Well, Matt, thank you so much. Thank you also for putting in the plug for the internship job fair. The link is in the chat. So again, thank you so much for being here today, Sarah.